Hey everyone, I'm Vedika. I'm the Senior Product Designer for the Pipeline Execution team. And right now I'm going to give a summary of the UX scorecard activity that I performed for the feature set that is associated with variables in GitLab CI. Now let's look at why is it that we do this exercise to begin with. So the UX scorecard for us, it's a way to identify and score the usability of an experience in our product based on a set of heuristics. And we also use UX scorecard as an opportunity to find how our users are interacting with our product and to even identify some areas where we can make an improvement. Talking about the process, we started off by selecting a jobs to be done, which was the most relevant to the selected category or set of features. In this case, it was variables. Then we kind of happened to map the journey that users would take to perform the task associated with those jobs to be done. The next part was using heuristics to calculate a score. And once we had the heuristics evaluation and the observations in place, the next thing we did was putting some recommendations in place that we'd be working on later. So this was an introduction to what UX scorecards are. If you want to read more, we have this page in our handbook on UX scorecards, which has a very detailed documentation of the process. All right, so coming back, so the jobs to be done that we had selected for this particular scenario was control scope for CI/CD variables. What it says is when architecting pipeline configuration, I want to be able to define the variable so it is dynamically inherited across all hierarchies of a repository, an upstream or downstream pipeline in order to perform complex operations without scripting those tasks to save time across repositories. But what I'll do is I'll put them in very simple words. So what the workflows that we are referring to here is passing down variables from parent to child pipeline in the case of a monorepo setup, and passing variables from an upstream to a downstream pipeline in the case of multi-project setup. The two personas that we focused on were DevOps engineer and software developers, and in total we interviewed 5 users, out of which 3 were DevOps engineers and 2 were software developers. There are 4 external and 1 internal participant. All right, so the task in question was not something that could be performed only by the UI. So users mostly had to go and make modifications or even some additions to the GitLab CI YAML. So the pipeline definition was where using which this task had to be accomplished. And we were able to break this whole journey into 4 significant sections. The first is convert variables into transferable format. I just want to put across a disclaimer that these are some very overarching steps in the process, and the exact action would differ depending on what kind of variable you are working with, as well as what is the setup of your project. Is it monorepo? Is it multi-project? So the first is convert variables into a transferable format. The next is trigger the downstream pipeline from the upstream pipeline. Third is from the downstream side, you have to make sure that whatever is being passed on from the upstream pipeline is actually being received on the downstream side. And lastly, like for whatever purpose you are transferring the variable, maybe to use in some operation or maybe just to output the value, you're able to do that well. And then based on the exercise that we conducted, after observing our users perform the task, we were able to put together an experience map, and many things that we were able to bring together. And just to name a few, like we were able to, record the feelings that users had by performing certain actions on the platform, and then we have recorded some pain points. And then finally what we did was we tried to understand how we could translate those pain points into opportunities to make improvements. So what I'll do is I'll very quickly take you through the tasks that were set up and also talk about the opportunities that we have found in there, and then maybe revisit these opportunities which are put here on the experience map at the end. So let me go to the first project which was created. So the first project, the first task, what it asked from users was that they're in charge of two pipelines, one upstream, one downstream, and they had to ensure that an API doc is regenerated every time there's a release in the main project. And we are calling the upstream project as the main project. So the task was that, like, whenever there's a release in this particular project, which is the upstream, the downstream should auto-generate docs, and it should be tagged with the same version as the release, which is provided through this upstream pipeline. So first of all, when users went ahead to investigate more about what has been provided in the YAML definition, they figured that, okay, there are certain stages and jobs in place, but they're just variables like defined just like that. And they were not able to establish any connection with any downstream anywhere. Like, there's no mention of a downstream pipeline, there's no trigger, there's no include. So that was their first hint that they should first think of adding something in here. And then when they went to Google GitLab documentation to know what step they should be taking next, their first hint was that the downstream project that has been like provided here. So these have two separate YAMLs and they are two very separate projects. So probably something that they should look at is MultiProject, how the MultiProject pipelines, they handle variables. And when they finally made their way to the MultiProjects, on kind of scrolling down, they figured that there's a section that talks about passing CI/CD variables to downstream, which was like, yay, great. And so this does talk about, like, this does provide an example here in the first snippet that there's a job in place and there's another job that hosts the variable in the same job, as well as the trigger to the downstream. So users were able to like add a job and ensure that the stage is something that exists. Sorry, that they replace this with the variable that they want to transfer. But it was not very clear to them that this is just an example here, because some of them, they had mistaken this to be something very absolute, that this has to be critically part of the syntax. So there was some doubt about whether or not to remove this. And one suggestion was that maybe if we have multiple examples, it would become more clear that what is put just to be referred as an example and what not. And another thing that was observed, like when users were able to in fact add this job to trigger a downstream pipeline and to even, like pass a variable when they happen to like replace this with version number. Even then, when they forgot to remove the script from this job, they were encountering an error, and nowhere in the documentation has it been defined that in the same job where you are triggering the from where you are triggering the downstream pipeline, you cannot have script. So, yeah, and what else? Now, on the downstream side, when users landed, the first thing that they were like puzzled about was like, what is this doing here? So we provided this version number just as something to confuse them, so that they're able to apply their judgment on what would take precedence. But most of them ended up like removing this altogether from the YAML, so that whatever is inherited is not overridden by anything which has been locally defined. But what would have happened instead was the trigger variable would have definitely taken precedence over anything that has been defined locally in the downstream pipeline. So we need to put across this clarity in the precedence order of trigger variables. Another thing, and when users, like when they finally ran the pipeline, there was an indication here that the pipeline for this project was running, when it was a success. But unless they go to the pipeline through here and in fact enter the pipeline graph, there was no clear indication of whether the downstream pipeline was initiated at all. So, I mean, if we can have some indication on the overview page as well as the pipeline index page that, Yeah. So unless they came all the way to here in the pipeline graph, they were not able to, know that the downstream has been triggered and it has started to run. In most cases, users ended up going to the downstream project and then looking at the status of the pipeline through their respective pipeline pages, which is kind of a broken experience. So here, it only provides the information about the downstream pipeline in isolation, and similarly on the upstream side, it provides the information about the upstream pipe in isolation. So the association is missing. There's no indication that some transaction is happening between the upstream and downstream, and like one is connected to the other. It is happening through this pipeline graph, but from nowhere else. So that was a critical observation. Then, let's come to the second scenario. In the second scenario, we again provided users with one upstream and one downstream project. And this time what they had to do was they had to pass on some environment credentials to a downstream pipeline so that that downstream project, another set of users could use those credentials in the downstream project to run some integration tests. And we had set up the upstream as well as the downstream. And again, it was easy to figure out that this is a multi-project situation. So users, of course, landed on the similar page, on the same page in the documentation. But they were mostly stuck in this area, and they were having trouble, only using variables to kind of transfer those variables to downstream. And it was unfortunate because we have this specific section which says with variable inheritance. And this is specifically this is very much suitable for that particular task because it talks about how the environment variables could be bundled into a .env report and be shared with the downstream. But upon hinting, when users finally landed on this section, they were able to add a section like this section to the upstream file. And what this is doing is it is kind of wrapping up the environment variables into a .env report. And they also added another job which triggered the downstream pipeline. But there was still this question that they had in mind, that how is it being transferred to the downstream pipeline? Because there are two separate jobs here. So what they ended up doing was they ended up going to the job logs for the upstream in a hope that there would be a download artifact button present where they could just download the artifact and then upload it to the downstream repository. They did not have this idea that it's going to be, passed automatically. Similarly, on the other side, this as an example, it was not very clear that not everything out here is mandatory, and certain links are only provided as an example. But this was still pretty easy to grasp, despite the confusion. So this worked pretty well. Another observation was that whenever users had to put the link for downstream or upstream, and in this case, they had to do that pretty often, they always had to go to another project, take the URL from there and paste it here. If only there could be a simpler way to do that. And then coming back to see if we have missed any opportunities which have been documented here. So we talked about adding more diversified examples to docs. Then we also talked about that linters should provide more explanatory warnings for trigger and needs. For example, the situation where users ended up adding a script to the job from where downstream was triggered, and it was difficult to understand why they were getting an error for their for what they were doing. For example, this one. This is an example of an error that they were receiving. Then we also talked about adding more visual indication to represent the association between upstream and downstream pipeline. And lastly, clarify the precedence order for trigger variables. So based on whatever we observed and in the whole exercise, the overall heuristic score that has been given to this jobs to be done is 2.83. So we do have a lot of improvements to make here, and hopefully we'll get started on that pretty soon. Thank you so much. That's all that I have to share around this.